Let's talk about ransomware. You see, I have some opinions, and I put it to you that there is no such thing as a ransomware attack. Now, allow me to explain what I mean by that. You see, for me, ransomware is just a payload. If you say ransomware attack, it makes it sound like a single event and a contained idea. Whereas really, if you look at things like the actions that I take during a penetration test, and then what a modern ransomware attack looks like, they are very similar. We'll get to that in a second. But look back at historical examples of ransomware, something like the AIDS Trojan from 1989. Yes, ransomware is 3 decades old. The AIDS Trojan was distributed on physical floppy disks. It demanded a monetary ransom to be paid via banker's draft to a PO box in Panama. It has some similarities to modern ransomware payloads. Of course, now we're using cryptocurrencies instead of banker's drafts, but broadly speaking, the payloads are similar. But how the actual attack took place, there's very few similarities. Compare it to something like the Travelex breach that hit that organization in early 2020, and there's really not that many similarities. So how do modern ransomware attacks work? What are the actual stages that the attacker goes through? Well, it's going to be things like network mapping, user account compromise, privilege escalation, propagation, and then ultimately deployment of the ransomware. If you were to compare that to something like the theft of intellectual property, well, an attack like that would probably go network mapping, user account compromise, privilege escalation, propagation, and you get the idea. Major aspects of those two attacks are very similar. The ransomware aspect is just the payload that is deployed at the end. So ransomware attack, I think, is a bad term to use because it makes it seem like a single action in a single point in time, whereas really organizations should be looking at this as an attack chain. What stages does the attacker go through and where can we have impact? And impact in this category could be hardening systems to make the attacker's job more difficult or ultimately aiming to stop the attacker. Or it could be something like speeding up your incident response capability, getting more information to the team as soon as possible. If you can improve in either of those two areas at any stage of the attack chain, you'll be in a better position. Now, I see this coming from both mainstream media and the InfoSec community. Mainstream media just gloss over many of the technical details as you'd expect by saying ransomware attack and generally going into no more detail. But even the InfoSec community generally oversimplifies what's happening. I see many people within the community saying ransomware is simple, just take good backups, as if that solves everything. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't take backups, and I'm not saying that backups wouldn't help, but I'm saying there's more to these types of attacks than just simply take backups. For one thing, active attackers within the network are going to target backups and try and disrupt your ability to restore them. And also, we're seeing a lot of complex attacks these days. For example, where the threat group are stealing personal information and then using that as leverage, threatening to release the personal information and causing a data breach, unless the organization pays the ransom. So just restoring the data doesn't prevent any of those other aspects of that attack. So what can we do? Well, there's a few different things. First of all, if we're looking at the attack chain that I mentioned earlier and looking at what stages can we harden systems to make the attacker's job more difficult and ultimately try and either limit the impact or stop the attack altogether, then something like penetration testing is going to help that. But with these attacks being very broad and aspects such as backups being important, aspects such as incident response being important, then something like a maturity assessment or a cybersecurity action plan are going to help, where an organization looks at every aspect of your cybersecurity plan and spots what you've missed or where you've underinvested. My experience working with a lot of InfoSec professionals is we bring our own bias. People know this when they see me speak. Very often I speak from the point of view of a penetration tester because that's what I spend most of my time doing. So sometimes when we have things like head of IT or head of security who've maybe got a software development background, they maybe over-focus on things like the software security lifecycle, those kinds of things. That's not a negative point against software developers, that's just an example. Whatever your background is, you might overly focus on those areas and miss other critical details. So having an independent organization come in and review every aspect and demonstrate your maturity in those areas, it's going to spot something that you missed. Or, another thing, the third piece of advice that I'd give you, build muscle memory. So do something like incident response testing. Now, this can be a full-blown simulating a ransomware attack and following through every stage, Or it could be something simple like a tabletop exercise, where you sit down and you follow through an example of an attack, something like the Travelex breach, or really any similar breach that you're trying to test your response to, and see how well rehearsed is your organization at following through that action plan, the incident response plan. See, many organizations I work with have incident response plans, but they never really look at them. Or maybe they have playbooks, but they only practice one or two of them. So something like incident response scenario testing, sitting down as a tabletop exercise, is a good place to start. So yes, backups can help against ransomware attacks, and backups are great. But that is not the only thing you should be focusing on. Cybersecurity testing like penetration testing, maturity assessments like cybersecurity action plans, and testing that muscle memory through things like incident response testing. Those are all going to help you respond to ransomware attacks. Because there's more to ransomware than just taking backups.